Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Welcome to the media launch for the India Energy Outlook 2021. We're delighted this morning to present the report and the findings. You will find all the findings as well as the full report for free on our website. This morning we have with us Dr. Fatih Birol, the Executive Director of the IEA, as well as Tim Gould, the head of the IEA's Energy Supply Outlooks and Investment Division. Dr. Birol will present the report, and Tim will give us a presentation of the main findings. This presentation will be followed by a Q&A session. We hope to have the whole media launch last about 45 minutes, but we will be sure to take as many questions as possible from the press. Just a note for representatives of the media, please use the Zoom app to send us your questions in the Q&A box. And with that, I would like to turn the floor to Dr. Fatih Birol. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jad. Greetings from International Energy Agency headquarters, dear colleagues. Welcome to the launch of the India Energy Outlook 2021 of the International Energy Agency. Before going to our report, I just wanted to say that as IEA, all the colleagues at the IEA, on behalf of them, I wanted to express our condolences to those families who have suffered from devastating floods and a landslide in northern India. Our hearts go out to those families. Some of you know, I guess, that only a few days ago, we had another major event related to India. This event was to sign a framework for a strategic partnership between the International Energy Agency and the government of India, with the top-level government officials from India, from International Energy Agency member countries and others. And today, we are here to talk about the India Energy Outlook. You might be asking, why such a strong focus for IEA analysis, IEA engagement with India? In my view, the answer is very simple. Some 6 years ago, when we published our first India Energy Outlook in 2015, today's is the second one. When we published in 2015 India Energy Outlook, I was in Delhi, I remember very well, together with Minister Goyal, Piyush Goyal, who was at that time Minister of Power, and Minister Pradhan, Minister of Petroleum. In that launch, I said clearly, India is moving to the center of the world energy stage. India is moving to the center of the world energy stage. And now I can say without hesitation that India has arrived to the center of the world energy stage. Whichever part of the energy sector you are interested in, it can be oil, it can be coal or solar or emissions, investments, battery storage, you have to understand India's priorities in order to make sense of global energy trends. And it is the reason that we are working very closely with the Indian government in many fronts in order to support the Indian government as Indian government makes major efforts in terms of providing energy, affordable energy, cleaner energy to its citizens. And what we see, the Indian energy trends will be more and more influential for global energy trends. And hence, we made this report, the new India Energy Outlook we are launching today. It was a priority for me at the IEA, this report, and therefore I have asked one of our most capable managers, Mr. Tim Gould, to lead a big team across the International Energy Agency, working with different academics, industry, the finance, but most importantly, with our colleagues in India to make this report. I am thankful to Mr. Gould, as well as his colleague, Mr. Peter Zimanski, and in Paris, and Mr. Siddharth Singh in New Delhi, to put this report together with all the great support of the colleagues in Paris, in India, and elsewhere. Now, I wanted to highlight from this report, which is an excellent report, as the many reports of Mr. Gould, 4 points, which I believe is critical to see what is happening in India and how would it affect the global trends. First of all, India today, as we speak today, it is the 3rd largest energy consumer of the world, and the scope for growth is huge in the next years to come. When we look at all of our scenarios, we have a lot of scenarios in the IEA, which is driven by different economic assumptions, driven different policies, but in all of them, India has the highest share of global energy demand growth than any single other country. So highest share of global energy demand growth comes from India, whatever scenario, whatever assumptions you look at. Why? Economy is growing and will be growing very strongly, and urbanization and industrialization are key drivers. In terms of urbanization, huge amount of new population will be added to the urban population in India. Just looking at the urban part here, and in the, just to put in a context, in the next 20 years, next 2 decades, India urban population will add 13 new Mumbais. 13 new Mumbais will be added to Indian urban population. This means more cement, more iron steel, buildings, mobility needs, electricity, among others. Huge growth. Just to give you one number, which I found very interesting in the report, the electricity, the power plants India will add in the next 20 years is equal to what the entire Europe has today. So in addition, what India has today, a huge power capacity, will add 1 Europe in the next 20 years. And it's, of course, very important for the Indian citizens. What will be the price of electricity? Whether or not it will add or help to reduce the air quality emissions. And what are the choices, what technologies will be critical for India, and giving the size for the world. And just wanted to say that India will need a lot of energy, in my view, which is a good thing. Energy is a good thing. Emissions are a bad thing. And what is also bad is lack of energy rather than the energy itself, because energy means economic growth, comfortable lives, and others. So big growth is coming there. And I have a real confidence and the trust in the Indian government when it comes to the energy sector to deal with these issues, not only based on the discussions I have with different ministers in New Delhi, but most importantly, what they have achieved. More than 900 million people have access to electricity since the year 2000. The Ujjwala program, more and more citizens, especially low-income citizens of India, have access to clean cooking, which is still a major issue, but I know Minister Pradhan and his team is working hard on that. The program on the efficient lighting, the LEDs, are excellent. So I can go on and on. Major efforts, and of course, I shouldn't forget the huge achievements in the renewable energy, which is my second point. Now, we have published our global world energy outlook only a few months ago. And when we launched the report, before launching the report, I discussed with my colleagues about the numbers and so on. And it was very striking for the world how important the solar energy will be. Because it is the source of electricity generation which grows the most. And it is the reason I have crowned solar as the new king of global electricity markets. It's growing so much across the world. But when it comes to India, the potential is huge, mainly driven by the extraordinary cost competitiveness of solar, government support, again coming to government, Prime Minister Modi's putting a very determined target for renewables plays a very important role here. And we expect India, in the years to come, will be the country among all the countries in the world which has the highest share of solar in its electricity generation among any other country in the world. And therefore, I think it is not wrong to call India that India will be a solar nation, set to be a solar nation, India, with all this potential. This is definitely great news. And again, the cost and the political determination is very important. Now, one challenge, though, this is the third point I wanted to mention, is while the share of solar is growing together with renewables, because when we look at our numbers, today, share of solar is less than 5% in India, and share of coal is about 70%. And if you put the right policies in place, our numbers show that within 10 years of time, even before 10 years, renewables, mainly solar, can take over coal and become the first source of electricity generation in India. So, but this brings a challenge with itself, namely, when you look at the electricity consumption in India, especially in the evening, when the air conditioners start to run, we see a mismatch between the availability of solar in the evening and the peak electricity demand. And here, it is critical that we find solutions to this mismatch through creating flexibilities in the system, ranging from hydropower as providing flexibility to natural gas, to battery storage. Again, there's a very strong, I would suggest you, chapter on battery storage, shows that India will be a leader, global leader in battery storage in the next years to come. Now, last 2 points. Solar is growing, renewables are growing, it is good, but India will need more than solar, because electricity is one part of the energy consumption, energy use. You have also industry, especially iron steel industry, cement industry, and others, and transport sector, mainly trucks, which is the main driver of the road transport, oil demand growth. So therefore, it is very important that on one hand, India is set to industrialize the economy. On the other hand, India finds way, in its own way, with its own priorities, to provide the clean energy solutions. It can be renewables, it can be natural gas, it can be hydrogen, it can be carbon capture and storage. Because when we look at the trends, with the current policy setting, India's reliance on the imported oil will grow very strongly, raising questions about the trade bills and also security of Indian energy supply. So therefore, looking at the alternative options will be here very important. And I would like to also say that the solutions that India will find in terms of, on one hand, economic growth, on the other hand, a low emission strategy will be, once again, a source of inspiration to many countries, developing countries around the world. Today, Indian emissions are only 40% lower. It is 40% lower than the global averages. So India, absolute emissions are growing, but per capita emissions, Indian per capita emissions are 40% lower than the world average per capita emissions. This is something to bear in mind. Finally, ladies and gentlemen, India is growing, will be growing economy, population, energy use, but how to steer the Indian energy policy? On one hand, providing fuel for the economic growth, but on the other hand, pushing the clean energy options to address the air quality issues and other emission issues will be critical. And International Energy Agency is very keen to work with India as a strategic partner, and hopefully soon seeing India as an eventual full member of the International Energy Agency sometime soon. And with these words, I would like to turn to my colleague, Mr. Tim Gould, who is in charge of this work. Mr. Gould.
Thank you very much, Executive Director, for these opening words. I'd like to now just go into a little bit more detail on some of the key findings from our outlook. And indeed, as has already been mentioned, India has seen some really extraordinary energy successes in recent years, whether that's electricity connections or the investment boom in renewables or the rapid uptake of highly efficient LED lighting. But we've also some long-standing issues which in many ways have been complicated by the global pandemic. Still issues with the reliability of power supply. As was mentioned, there is continued reliance on firewood and other solid biomass as a cooking fuel. And we also need to have in mind that energy is at the root of the air quality problems that many Indians face in their homes and cities. And as we put together this energy outlook for India, we had to grapple with two big uncertainties, two big near-term questions. First was the duration and severity of the global pandemic and its economic impacts. And second, the response from governments and companies, not only in India, but across the world, as they rebuild economies and rebuild balance sheets, while also tackling the urgent threat of climate change and other environmental hazards. And as we reflect on these uncertainties in our scenarios, which consider different possible energy futures for India, and I would like to underline that none of these scenarios is an IEA forecast. So we explore today's Indian policy settings and targets and how they play out in a variety of post-COVID settings. And we also examine ways to accelerate progress towards climate and other Sustainable Development Goals. And in the near term, that means a key task is to map out possible ways from today's crisis. And in the stated policy scenario, we assume that the pandemic is brought under control in the course of 2021. And then we make a balanced assessment of the direction that India's policies and ambitions take the energy economy. Not all of those targets or ambitions are met in full or within the envisaged time period, because of a range of kind of real world constraints that might affect their implementation. But the result is this: after a 5% fall in energy demand in 2020, it's quite a rapid rebound in India's energy use, which grows by more than 1/3 over the next decade. But of course, this is not the only way that things could evolve. We examine a downside case in the event of prolonged economic impacts from the pandemic, and this delayed recovery scenario would put at risk some of India's hard-won gains in the fight against energy poverty. But likewise, we explored an upside case for India with a faster rebound in the economy, but also a more complete realization of India's stated policy objectives. This India vision case introduces a theme that we'll come back to many times in the presentation and perhaps in the discussion, the way that government policies can shape the outlook. Because even though economic growth is higher, a faster move away from inefficient solid biomass and faster introduction of more efficient technologies means that higher economic growth combines with a lower trajectory for energy demand growth, without any loss in the energy services available to the population. But whichever way the energy world evolves from here, India will be really central to global trends. Over the past 20 years, it was China that was the single largest source of growth, but that changes in all of our scenarios to 2040. India is out in front. It soon becomes the most populous country in the world, but in addition, as China becomes a more service-driven economy and India builds up its national infrastructure, there is this pivot, an incredibly important pivot in global manufacturing towards India. And that makes industrialization a very important part of our outlook. But that's closely tied together with another hugely influential trend that the executive director mentioned, urbanization. That massive growth in the urban population that he referred to leads to a very rapid increase also in India's building stock. There's residential floor space more than doubles, and there's a large increase in demand for construction materials, whether that's steel, cement, or plastics, as well as other manufactured goods. And this construction boom is also being fueled by the strong focus on public housing that the government has under its Housing for All by 2022. And the model of urbanization that India follows is really a crucial factor for industry and transport demand. Whether India's cities are compact or sprawling, whether they're formal or informal, whether they're governed by energy efficient building codes or not, these are decisions that build in very long-lived patterns of energy consumption. And that transition to urban life is also associated with transitions in energy demand, in particular a shift towards electricity. So as incomes rise, so households take on an increasing range and variety of appliances and equipment. The one that we're highlighting here, and the one that really stands out in our projections, is the rise in demand for cooling, for air conditioners. At the moment, on average, there's one air conditioner for every 50 Indian citizens, compared with one for every citizen in a country like Japan. But this is the fastest growth of any appliance that we see over the period to 2040. And it becomes the largest factor pushing energy demand up in the building sector as well. So we'll come back to the implications of this, but this is an area which we are working very closely on efficiency standards and other areas with the Indian government in support of the government's India Cooling Action Plan. So what are the implications of this for the various fuels and technologies that make up India's energy system? So this is how the fortunes fare in our stated policy scenario, in which India makes up 1/4 of the rise in global demand. And what you're looking at on the screen is already a major reordering of India's energy priorities in the decades to come. So renewables meet the largest share of growth over the next 2 decades, not only in the power sector, but also by harnessing India's potential for direct use of modern bioenergy in end-use sectors, whether that's biomass in industry or biogases for clean cooking or biofuels for transport. Next largest share is oil. This is also mainly for transport, as some 300 million vehicles of all types are added to India's fleet over the next 2 decades. As the executive director mentioned, trucks play a very important role here, half the growth in demand for road transport. Electrification has a very significant inroads, makes really significant inroads for 2 or 3 wheelers, but less so in this scenario for passenger cars. And that result is a 4 million barrel a day increase in oil demand, making India the largest growth market for oil worldwide in this scenario. Onto coal. Over the last 3 decades, almost 3/4 of the growth in coal demand went to power generation, but this is now dramatically different. Growth slows and is now concentrated in industry, especially for iron and steel and cement. Natural gases, indeed gases of all kinds, play increasingly important roles in India's energy future. They're growing from quite a low base. Gas meets only around 6% of India's current demand. That's one of the lowest shares in the world, and India has clear ambitions to raise this share. And that's reflected in our projections. Gas, likewise, going a lot to fuel India's industrial growth, but also in city gas distribution for transport and cooking. Nuclear power also plays an important role in India's future. New reactor recently commissioned in Gujarat, and several more are under construction. And we project steady growth from this source. And there's one element of India's energy mix that declines, and this decline is in practice a positive signal for India's development as people continue to switch away from solid biomass to modern fuels to meet their energy needs. I'd like to say a few words about electricity. One element of continuity in all of our projections, in all of our scenarios, is that India sees very strong growth in electricity demand, but in most other respects, the future looks very different from the past. Up until recently, electricity consumption and coal demand walked together, both nearly tripled since the year 2000, but now they part company. And instead it's renewables led by solar that rise, and that's underpinned by India's policy ambitions, so the 450 gigawatt target, and also the low technology costs that make solar India's cheapest option for new capacity. And as was mentioned, at the moment, you can see on the screen, solar PV, less than 5% of India's power generation, coal close to 70. But in the stated policy scenario, within 2 decades, those shares are converging. And the transformation is even more rapid in the sustainable development scenario, which maps out the way for the world and indeed for India to accelerate progress to meet the objectives of the Paris Agreement, as well as air quality and energy access goals. So in this scenario, solar and wind generation overtake that of coal within the next 10 years. That's a huge investment challenge. Investment in the power sector would need to double already over the next 10 years to meet India's needs and to realize the sort of transformation that you're looking at here in the generation mix. This means tackling some risks related to delayed payments to generators, risks related to land acquisition, but also some regulatory and contract uncertainty. It would also require some continued regulatory innovation of the sort that we already saw in 2020 with India's first ever round-the-clock renewable energy auction, which meant bundling together solar with other generation and technologies and with storage. And the reason why these kinds of approaches are vital is another element that the executive director referred to, the importance of flexibility. The rest of the system cannot stand still while solar rises. And more than almost any other country in the world, India will face a huge increase in the need for flexibility in its power system. So how much are those flexibility needs increasing? Well, a good way to think about it is to look how much does the rest of the system need to change from one hour to the next in order to compensate for varying output from wind and solar PV. This is the situation today, and each of those dots is one of those hourly adjustments in 2020. So you can see that the rest of the system might need to adjust by something in the order of 5% from hour to hour because the sun rises or it goes down, or the wind picks up or it dies down. But this variability increases sharply already within the next 10 years, by which time the hourly adjustments required due to changes in solar and wind generation, much higher, states like Karnataka, Tamil Nadu and Gujarat at the forefront of this change. And this is just the supply side. There's also that demand variability that's related to cooling, as was mentioned before. So India will really need to mobilize all forms of flexibility, whether that's the grid, whether that's the existing coal-fired fleet or hydropower or gas generation. And as was mentioned, batteries have a very important role to play here. So India becomes a global leader in battery deployment in our scenarios, to align its solar-led generation peak in the middle of the day with the country's early evening peak in demand. And there are also some more traditional energy security concerns that emerge from our projections, namely India's high reliance on imported fuels. This is the situation up until 2020. It's expressed in the dollar values. You can see how India's fuel import bill came down last year with lower oil prices, but it's also very visible that fuel imports are dominated by oil and that they're higher in value than domestic output. And in recent years, energy has accounted for almost 1/3 of India's total imports by value. And over the period to 2040, India's efforts to stimulate domestic fuel production, they do bear fruit. That includes offshore gas from the Krishna Godavari Basin and higher domestic coal output. But these efforts do not keep up with demand. And this means a rising import bill, growing exposure to global market conditions and possible market volatility. And the vulnerabilities relate in particular to oil, where projected import dependence rises from 75% today to more than 90% in 2040. And now an accelerated energy transition and lower fuel consumption of the sort modeled in the Sustainable Development Scenario would make a huge difference to this picture. That would cut the import bill by well over half, a cumulative saving to 2040 of $1.4 trillion. There are some warning signs too in terms of emissions, even though, as the executive director mentioned, in per capita terms, India remains one of the lowest emitters on the planet. So per capita CO2 emissions today, only 40% of the global average, and they remain well below the global average in 2040 in this scenario. And the first line that you see on the screen here is really a major Indian success story. India's electricity demand goes up by some 150% over the next 2 decades. But the new power plants that are built to meet this rise, they leave a very light environmental footprint. This is a tribute to the remarkable rise of solar and other low emissions technologies. But of course, it's not the whole story. There are also India's existing plants, notably its coal-fired plants that are on average around 15 years old and so continue to run in this scenario for years to come. And we also need to look outside the power sector, particularly at emissions from industry and from transport. So emissions from existing sources, whether that's factories and vehicles, they come down gradually as equipment is retired or replaced. But the expansion of India's industrial and transport infrastructure results in large additional emissions from a new range of sources, and that's despite a range of policy efforts. So indeed, by the late 2030s, most of India's projected emissions come from new factories, trucks, cars, buildings, and other sources that don't exist today. Now, as many countries and policymakers are aware, these transport and industrial emissions, areas like road freight, steel and cement, they're far more challenging to develop in a sustainable manner than power generation, where India has made huge strides. But we think there's nonetheless a huge opening for policies to steer India onto a more secure and sustainable course. And my last slide looks at some elements of that accelerated transformation. Many of them are already visible in India's energy policy vision today. And this push for a new model of low carbon inclusive growth is given additional impetus in our sustainable development scenario. Now, as you can imagine, solar, clean electricity, battery technologies play a huge part, but in practice, India would need to deploy a very wide range of technologies and approaches. Some of those would bring that clean electricity into India's end-use sectors, notably through a faster rise in electric mobility. But there's also huge investment in more efficient industrial processes, as well as a strong rise in sustainable fuels, biogases, but also hydrogen. We've noted with a lot of interest the prospect of a new national hydrogen energy mission in India. All of this, of course, comes with a cost. The additional investment in clean energy technologies is significant. That's $1.4 trillion above the level in the stated policy scenario. But you may recall that this is also the sum that India saves in lower fuel import bills. A few concluding words before we move to take your questions. I hope this presentation has given you a sense of the dynamism and sheer scale of India's development over the coming decades, which will keep India at the heart of the global energy system. Rise of renewables led by solar is really central to our outlook, but the speed of that rise will depend on investment issues, as well as what happens in the rest of the power sector. And much of the conversation about India's energy system and its future rightly focuses on the transformation underway in electricity. But it's really essential to pay close attention to other sectors as well. Industry, transport are driving many trends in global fuel markets as well as emissions. And that leads me to a reminder that even as solar pushes India's clean energy transitions forward, there is no single or simple answer to India's energy needs. India will really need a wide variety of innovative and sustainable technologies to mitigate the risks that we've identified to its energy security, but also its environment and air quality. The size of the prize is really huge. A low carbon inclusive path can bring benefits not only to India's citizens, but would also show the way for many other developing economies who are looking for demonstration that robust economic growth is fully compatible with an increasing pace of emissions reduction and the achievement of other development goals. And as the Executive Director emphasized, in this endeavor, India can count on the enduring support and partnership of the International Energy Agency. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Tim, for the presentation. We're going to take a short minute break to compile the questions from the journalists. Please send your questions through the Q&A in the Zoom. And while you send your questions, we will show you a short video on India. Thank you. Thank you. So we're back. We have a number of questions that have come in already. We will take them, maybe a number of questions together, Dr. Birol. The first group of questions about emissions. What are your expectations for India's CO2 emissions in coming decades? Tagging along a second question, do you expect India to join the group of countries that are committed to net zero emissions by 2050? And the third question, on India's coal fleet. India's existing coal fleet is a major source of emissions. What are ways to tackle that, given the presentation you made? Probably for you, Tim. Dr. Birol?
Okay. So maybe Tim, you get the coal question. You get the coal, and try to answer the India emissions. First of all, today the immediate environmental challenge in India is the air pollution in the cities. And air quality is a major issue. But as it happens, we see that there are a lot of similarities of the solutions to address air quality and the carbon dioxide emissions. As I tried to say, and also as did my colleague Mr. Gould, India's current per capita emissions are much lower than the global averages. We have to make it clear from a fairness point of view. But I believe it is in the interest of the Indian economy, Indian citizens, to push for a clean energy future. It is true that the pushing the clean energy options, it can be solar, it can be hydrogen, it can be bioenergy, whatever, this would need some additional investments compared to going with the existing traditional technologies. Now, having said that, my colleagues have calculated the additional investments for the clean energy technologies needed to have a sustainable clean energy future in India would be cancelled by the reduction of the oil import bills of the country. So you reduce the oil import bills through different policies. I give you one example. I said that the oil demand, a major driver of oil demand is trucks, the freight across the country. And the railways, Indian Railways is making one after the other, writing a success story there. Railways used to transport the freight would be a one way of reducing the oil demand. And if this electrification of the railways are done by using renewable energies, as Mr. Piyush Goyal is aiming today, will be beneficial. So I have high expectations from there. And being the part of net zero group or not, it's up to the Indian government to decide. But up to now, several governments around the world, EU, UK, Japan, Korea, China, and Canada, they committed themselves to net zero 2050. And they have asked the International Energy Agency to provide the right energy policies to underpin those commitments. We are working with them. If the Indian governments would make such a commitment, we will definitely be at the service of the Indian government. And I stop here and turn my colleague, Mr. Good, for the coal question.
Yeah, thank you very much. There's a question on the emissions from coal, from India's existing coal-fired fleet, which, as we're all aware, is a very large and relatively young fleet. I mentioned in the presentation that the average age of the coal plants in India is around 15 years. And indeed, what happens in the sustainable development scenario is that there are a number of different strategies that are available to bring down the emissions from that existing fleet. One of them is to repurpose the plants for the dramatic changes that are taking place in India's electricity system. And to some degree, that's already visible today as the utilization rates for coal power plants have come down quite substantially in recent years. And that means, in a sense, preparing them both from a market design question, but also in a technical manner for more flexible operation as a complement to solar. There are also opportunities to co-fire some of these plants with solid biomass or other low carbon fuels. Another option is to retrofit, so to capture the emissions, and indeed that's is evident also in the sustainable development scenario with some deployment of carbon capture technologies for parts of this fleet. And then the third option, of course, particularly for older and less efficient plants, is retirement. But I think this highlights an incredibly important point, which we try to emphasize also in our broader World Energy Outlook. Energy transitions is not just about what you build, it's also to the dealing with the emissions from what you have already. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tim. I'm going to take two more questions. I'm very conscious of the time. There are many questions coming in, but perhaps we can take two more. Dr. Birol, first one from Dinakar Iyer from Argus. The STEPS scenario paints a dismal picture for energy security in India, while the SDS scenario is very optimistic. Which do you think India will follow? And perhaps the second one to you, Tim, from Lou Del Bello from Lights On. How important is it to reform the distribution sector to achieve energy transition in India?
Thank you very much, Jet. Yeah, energy security is definitely a great challenge for many nations around the world. And our numbers show that especially for oil demand soaring in India with the existing policies, with the STEPS scenario, as you mentioned, will have major implications for the Indian trade balance in the next years to come, and also provide a vulnerable economic and energy system vis-a-vis maybe oil price spikes or volatility in the prices or geopolitical tensions here and there. So therefore, what do we need to do? We need to reduce the oil use in the Indian economy as much as possible. I gave one example, which was the freight, a major driver of the Indian oil demand growth, to be replaced, trucks to be replaced by the railway. This is one example. The other one is in terms of the electrification of the 2- and 3-wheelers. The electric cars should be part of the Indian mobility system. Once again, one may think that the moving to electrified railways from trucks, moving from the internal combustion engine cars, the current cars we use, to electric cars or 2-3 wheelers with the electricity, may need additional money, which is true. But if you compare this with the amount of money you are saving from the oil import bills, you are better off only from economic point of view, but also you are preparing your country for a cleaner, securer energy future. So therefore, it will be definitely the sovereign decision of the Indian government which way they will go. At the IEA, we will support the Indian government whatever they will go, but we show the benefits of taking policies, putting policies in place to reach a sustainable Indian energy future.
Thank you. I'll take the question on the state electricity distribution companies, because I think this is an incredibly important issue for India, and of course it's an area in which policymakers have been heavily engaged with, because it's indeed true that the state, the discoms as they're known, they are the biggest financial uncertainty in that in the sort of value chain of India's power sector investment. And there's a number of reasons for these sort of persistent revenue shortfalls. The situation varies quite strongly state to state, but the net result is a very large backlog of payments due to generation companies, which climbed to over 18 billion by the end of last year. And you can see also in the recent budget announcements, this is very much in the mind of India's policymakers as well. Cost reflectiveness of tariffs is very important over time, but there's also a lot more that can be done to increase the efficiency of the billing process, the technical losses through the system. And we highlight in some quite detailed analysis in the outlook the ways that could happen over time. But we certainly recognize that action in this area is an incredibly important topic for India's energy future.
Many thanks, Tim. Many thanks, Dr. Birol. We're really running out of time, so I would like to thank everyone for their attendance. Thank you for the presentations. We have several more questions we are not going to get time to answer from colleagues from Times of India, Economic Times, Recharge News, and others. We will definitely get back to you by email. And also, if you have any other outstanding questions, please email us at press@iea.org. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your attendance. Thank you.